The photograph stared back at me from my phone screen with crystalline clarity, each pixel a tiny dagger piercing through the carefully constructed illusion I'd been living in for 3 years. There, wrapped around Melissa's perfectly manicured finger, was my grandmother's engagement ring. The one David had proposed with just 18 months ago. The one that had been in my family for 4 generations. The one I'd specifically told him could never, under any circumstances, leave our family. The sickening thud in my chest wasn't surprise. It was recognition. This was exactly who David had always been, and I was exactly the fool who had chosen to ignore every red flag he'd waved in my face. I set the phone down on my kitchen counter with mechanical indifference, my hands steadier than they'd been in months. The apartment felt different already, like the air itself had shifted, become lighter somehow. For the first time in longer than I cared to calculate, my mind was quiet. Not the desperate, anxious quiet I'd grown accustomed to, the kind that comes from constantly walking on eggshells around someone else's mood, but the profound, crystalline silence of absolute clarity. I had exactly 47 hours before David returned from his business trip to Seattle. 47 hours to reclaim my life. Looking back now, I can see how meticulously I'd been groomed for this moment. Not in the dramatic, obvious way you see in movies, but through the slow, systematic erosion of my boundaries, my confidence, my very sense of reality. David had been a master craftsman at this particular art, though I doubt he saw it that way. In his mind, he was simply taking what he was owed. We'd met at a gallery opening 3 years prior. I was there for work. I'd just been promoted to senior curator at the Morrison Institute. And he was there with a client, some tech executive looking to invest in art the way people invest in cryptocurrency. David had approached me during the cocktail portion of the evening, all confident smiles and expensive cologne, asking insightful questions about the Jackson Pollock we were featuring. He'd done his homework, I'd thought at the time. How refreshing. "You're not just beautiful," he'd said over our third glass of wine that night. "You're brilliant. I can see why they gave you that promotion." I'd blushed, flattered by his attention. David was undeniably handsome. 6'2", dark hair always perfectly styled, the kind of man who looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine advertisement for luxury watches. More importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in my work, my thoughts, my dreams. After a string of relationships with men who'd glazed over the moment I mentioned my career, David felt like a revelation. The early months were intoxicating. He sent flowers to my office, planned elaborate weekend getaways to wine country, introduced me to his colleagues as my brilliant girlfriend, the curator. He attended every gallery opening, every museum fundraiser, always by my side with his hand on the small of my back, whispering how proud he was to be with me. But even then, there were moments. Small things that I dismissed or rationalized away. Like the time I'd gotten a call from the Smithsonian about a potential position, a dream job I'd been working toward my entire career. I'd been so excited that I'd called David immediately from my office. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," he'd said, but his tone had been flat, distracted. "Although, DC is so expensive, and you'd be starting over at a new institution. Might be worth considering whether it's really the right move for us." Us? Even though we'd only been dating for 6 months. Even though he'd never once considered how his own career moves might affect me. Or the way he'd gradually started making comments about my appearance. Never cruel, never obvious. David was far too sophisticated for that. Instead, they came wrapped in concern, in helpful suggestions. "Sarah, you have such beautiful eyes. Have you ever considered trying a more dramatic makeup look? I could ask my assistant to recommend someone. That dress is nice, but the color washes you out a bit. You should let me take you shopping. I have an excellent eye for what would look stunning on you. You've been working so hard lately, you look exhausted. Maybe we should book you a spa day?" Each comment was delivered with a kiss, with loving hands on my shoulders, with the kind of tender concern that made me question my own reaction. He loved me, didn't he? He was trying to help, wasn't he? Wasn't it sweet that he cared so much about how I looked? The isolation happened so gradually that I almost didn't notice it. My best friend Chloe was a little dramatic, don't you think? My sister Emma was still finding herself, and probably not the best influence right now. My weekly wine nights with colleagues became networking for networking's sake. And wasn't my time better spent on more meaningful pursuits? I just want to protect our time together, David would say when I mentioned missing my friends. You work such long hours, and when we finally get time alone, I want it to be special. Just us. And it was special, wasn't it? The elaborate dinners he planned, the weekend trips to his family's lake house, the quiet evenings where he'd massage my shoulders while I worked on exhibition proposals. He was attentive, romantic, completely focused on me when we were together. It wasn't until much later that I realized how carefully he'd orchestrated my world to revolve entirely around him. The proposal had been perfect, of course. He'd taken me to the same gallery where we'd met, arranged for a private viewing of a new contemporary exhibit. As we stood before a particularly striking piece, a sculpture about love and commitment, he'd dropped to one knee and pulled out my grandmother's ring. "I know how much family means to you," he'd said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your grandmother's ring should stay in the family. Will you marry me, Sarah?" I'd said yes through tears of joy, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. He'd remembered every story I'd told him about my grandmother, about how she'd fled Poland with nothing but that ring sewn into her coat, about how it had been passed down through 3 generations of strong women who'd built lives from nothing. "I'll take such good care of it," he'd promised, sliding the ring onto my finger. "Of the ring, and of you." The wedding planning had revealed new depths to David's controlling nature, though he'd framed it all as expertise and care. He had opinions about everything: the venue, the flowers, the guest list, my dress. When I'd suggested inviting some colleagues from the museum, he'd frowned. "Do we really want to mix work and personal life like that? This should be about family and close friends, the people who really matter." When I'd fallen in love with a vintage-inspired dress that reminded me of the 1920s pieces in our museum's collection, he'd guided me towards something more classic. "You want to look back at these photos in 20 years and still love what you see, don't you? Trends fade, but elegance is timeless." The dress I'd ended up with was beautiful, undeniably so. It was also nothing like what I'd originally wanted, and somehow, I'd convinced myself that David's taste was simply better than mine. The most insidious part was how he'd made me complicit in my own diminishment. He never forced me to do anything. Instead, he'd present his preferences with such certainty, such loving expertise, that disagreeing began to feel not just wrong, but almost cruel. He wanted the best for me, didn't he? He had such excellent taste, such a clear vision of what would make me happy. Who was I to argue? The cracks in the facade had started showing about 6 months after our engagement. I'd been offered a chance to curate a major exhibition on American modernism, a career-defining opportunity that would require extensive travel to coordinate loans from museums across the country. I'd been so excited I could barely contain myself as I told David about it over dinner. His reaction was swift and devastating. "Sarah, sweetheart, that sounds incredibly stressful, and we're planning a wedding. Don't you think you should be focusing on us right now? On building our life together?" "But David, this is exactly the kind of project I've been working toward my entire career. And it will always be there. Exhibitions happen every year, but we're only getting married once." He'd reached across the table to take my hand, his thumb stroking over my grandmother's ring. "Besides, all that travel, all those late nights, I'd miss you too much. We'd miss each other too much." I'd turned down the exhibition. The regret had eaten at me for weeks. But David had been so loving afterward, so attentive and grateful for my sacrifice for our relationship, that I'd almost convinced myself I'd made the right choice. The pattern became clear only in retrospect. Every opportunity that might expand my world, every person who might provide an outside perspective, every chance for independence was quietly, lovingly discouraged until I'd learned to preemptively eliminate them myself. It was more efficient that way, less friction in our relationship. By the time we'd moved in together 8 months ago, my world had shrunk to a precise circumference with David at the center. I saw my family for major holidays only. David found my mother's questions about his career a bit intrusive, and my father's political opinions exhausting. I'd lost touch with most of my friends through a combination of declined invitations and David's subtle suggestions that they didn't really understand our relationship. Even my work had become something we rarely discussed. David preferred to focus on our future, rather than dwelling on the day-to-day stress of my job. "You work too hard, darling," he'd say when I tried to share excitement about a new acquisition or frustration about budget cuts. "Let's talk about something more pleasant. How was your day otherwise?" The apartment we'd chosen together was beautiful, expensive, and entirely David's aesthetic. When I'd suggested incorporating some of my own furniture, pieces I'd collected over years of flea market hunting and estate sales, he'd gently explained why they wouldn't work. "Your style is charming, Sarah, but it's a bit eclectic. We want the space to feel cohesive, don't we? Sophisticated?" My furniture had gone into storage, along with my books that didn't match his color scheme, my artwork that clashed with his minimalist vision, and most of my photographs and personal mementos that created visual clutter. I'd adapted. I'd learned to see through David's eyes, to value his vision over my own instincts. It was easier that way, less conflict. And the apartment was undeniably beautiful. The kind of space you'd see in architectural magazines, all clean lines and muted colors and careful emptiness. It just didn't feel like home. The worst part wasn't the control itself. It was how skillfully David had taught me to gaslight myself. Every time I felt a flicker of resentment or doubt, I'd remind myself of all the ways he'd shown he loved me. The flowers, the romantic dinners, the expensive gifts. The way he'd hold me close and tell me I was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, the most intelligent, the most perfect. "I don't know what I did to deserve you," he'd whisper into my hair, and I'd melt against him, all my doubts temporarily silenced. It wasn't until I found myself apologizing for things I hadn't done, defending decisions I'd never made, and explaining away feelings I wasn't allowed to have that I began to realize something was fundamentally wrong. But even then, I couldn't quite name it. David never raised his voice, never called me names, never did any of the obvious things that would have made the situation clear. Instead, he'd perfected the art of loving me into a smaller and smaller version of myself. The business trips had started about 4 months ago. Sudden client emergencies, urgent deals that required his immediate presence in various cities. He'd always been apologetic about them, full of promises to make it up to me when he returned. "I hate leaving you, darling, but this could be the deal that sets us up for life. Just think. Maybe after this you won't have to work such long hours. We could travel, spend more time together." I'd supported him, of course. Told him I understood, that I was proud of his dedication, that I'd miss him but would be fine on my own. I'd even felt guilty about the small flutter of relief I experienced each time he left, the way I could breathe a little deeper in the empty apartment, make decisions without checking his preferences first, even something as simple as what to order for dinner. Those tiny tastes of autonomy should have been a warning sign. Instead, I'd pushed the feelings down, ashamed of myself for being anything less than completely devoted to the man I was supposed to marry. Last week, during his latest trip to Seattle, I'd been scrolling through Instagram before bed when I'd seen the photo that changed everything. Melissa Chen, David's assistant, had posted a picture from what looked like an upscale restaurant. She was holding up her left hand, laughing at something off camera, and there it was. My grandmother's ring, catching the light on her finger like it belonged there. The caption read, "When you know, hash engaged, hash surprise, hash blessed." I'd stared at that photo for probably 10 minutes, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was just a similar ring. Maybe David had bought her something as a placeholder while my ring was being cleaned or resized. Maybe, but deep down in the part of myself that I'd been systematically trained to ignore, I knew exactly what I was looking at. David had given my family heirloom, the ring he'd proposed with, the ring that represented 4 generations of strong women, to his assistant, while pretending to be on a business trip, while planning to marry me in 3 months. The betrayal was stunning in its casual cruelty. Not just that he was cheating, though that was devastating enough, but that he'd given away the one thing I'd explicitly told him could never leave our family. The one thing that connected me to my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my entire matrilineal history. He'd taken it and given it to someone else like it was his to give. That's when the silence in my head had started, the profound, crystalline quiet that comes when everything finally makes sense. I stood in our pristine apartment, looking around with new eyes. Everything here was David's: his furniture, his art, his vision of what our life should look like. I'd contributed nothing but my compliance and my slowly diminishing sense of self. But that was about to change. I pulled out my laptop and began making lists. Practical, methodical lists that would have made my grandmother proud. First, documentation. I screenshotted Melissa's Instagram post from every possible angle, saved the image to multiple cloud drives, and emailed copies to myself from 3 different accounts. Then I went through David's social media accounts, the ones he'd reluctantly given me access to after I'd asked why his Instagram was private, and found more breadcrumbs. Photos of him and Melissa at dinners that had allegedly been client meetings. Her hand visible in the corner of supposedly work-related pictures, sometimes wearing my ring, sometimes not. The pattern was clear once I knew what to look for. They'd been together for months, possibly since the business trips had started. While I'd been planning our wedding, supporting his career, and slowly disappearing into the background of my own life. Second, finances. I logged into every account, every investment, every shared expense. David had been subtly taking control of our financial life just as he'd taken control of everything else. We'd opened a joint account for wedding expenses and household costs, and somehow more and more of my paycheck had been flowing into it each month. For efficiency, he'd explained, for our future together. I transferred every penny of my money back to my individual accounts. Then I calculated exactly what I'd contributed to rent, utilities, groceries, and household expenses over the past 8 months, and transferred that amount out of his accounts into mine. He owed me $14,847 for my half of expenses I'd covered entirely on my own. Third, my grandmother's ring. This was going to be the most delicate operation, but also the most important. I couldn't let him know I knew about the affair, not yet. I needed to get the ring back first, and then I could make my exit. I called David, forcing my voice into the warm, loving tone he expected. "Hi, sweetheart. How's Seattle?" "Oh, the usual client drama. I'll be so glad to get home to you." His voice carried that familiar note of charming exhaustion, the successful businessman worn down by the demands of his career. I wondered if he used the same tone with Melissa. I was thinking about the wedding, and I realized we should probably get the ring insured. My grandmother's ring, I mean. It's the only irreplaceable thing we have. There was the briefest pause. "Of course, darling. That's very practical of you. We can take care of that when I get back." Actually, I was hoping to surprise you by handling it myself. Could you tell me which safety deposit box you've been keeping it in? I know you mentioned storing it somewhere secure. Another pause, longer this time. I've been keeping it in the safe at the office. You know how secure our building is?" Liar. But now I knew he was scrambling, trying to figure out how to get the ring back from his mistress without revealing his betrayal. Oh, that's smart. Would it be easier if I just stopped by and picked it up? I could coordinate with Melissa to make sure I don't interrupt any client meetings. "No." The sharpness in his voice was quickly covered by a laugh. "I mean, no need to bother Melissa with personal errands. I'll bring it home with me on Friday and we can go to the insurance office together. Make it a date." Friday. Today was Wednesday. He had 2 days to somehow get my ring back from the woman he was cheating with, the woman who'd been flaunting it on social media like a trophy. "That sounds perfect," I said, letting warmth flood my voice. "I love you, David." "I love you too, Sarah. More than anything." The ease with which he lied was breathtaking. After I hung up, I allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to feel the full weight of what he'd stolen from me. Not just my trust, not just our relationship, but my connection to the women who'd come before me. That ring had survived the Holocaust, the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and 3 immigrations to new countries. It had been worn by women who'd built lives from nothing, who'd raised families against impossible odds, who'd passed down stories of resilience and strength. And David had treated it like a disposable trinket, something to give to his latest conquest when he got bored with his current fiancée. The grief was brief, but devastating. Then it crystallized into something harder, cleaner: fury. Fourth, my belongings. I'd been living in David's world for so long that I'd almost forgotten what belonged to me. But as I walked through the apartment, I began to see the traces of my former self that had somehow survived his systematic erasure. My books were in storage, but I had others. Professional volumes I'd accumulated over the years, exhibition catalogs, art history texts. My laptop and the external drive containing years of research and writing, a few pieces of jewelry that had been gifts from my family, not from David. The camera equipment I'd used in graduate school before David had convinced me that photography was just a hobby and I should focus on my real career. My clothes, though many of them had been gradually replaced with items David had chosen for me. The skincare products and makeup I'd used before he'd started making suggestions about how I could enhance my natural beauty. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I started packing. Fifth, my exit strategy. This required the most careful planning. David would be expecting his compliant, loving fiancée to be waiting for him when he returned on Friday evening. Instead, he was going to find an empty apartment and a note explaining exactly what I knew and exactly what I thought of him. But I wasn't just leaving, I was disappearing completely. A clean break. A surgical removal of myself from his life. I'd been offered a position at a museum in Prague 18 months ago, before David had convinced me that international moves were too risky, too stressful, too far from our life in New York. I'd turned it down regretfully, but I'd kept in touch with the director. 6 weeks ago, she'd emailed me again. Their senior curator had decided to return to Germany, and they were looking for someone with my expertise to take over a major exhibition on American art in Europe. I deleted the email without responding, automatically dismissing any opportunity that would take me away from David. Now I pulled it up from my trash folder and began typing a response. Dear Dr. Kretschy, thank you for thinking of me for the position at the National Museum in Prague. I'm writing to inquire whether the opportunity is still available. Due to unexpected changes in my personal circumstances, I find myself able to consider international positions that were previously not feasible. I realize the timing may be unconventional, but if you're still seeking a senior curator for the American art exhibition, I would be very interested in discussing the role further. I could be available to start as early as next month. I apologize for the delay in my response and hope to hear from you soon. Best regards, Sarah Morrison. I sent the email before I could second-guess myself. Then I started researching flights to Prague, apartment rentals, international moving companies. I created new email accounts that David couldn't access, updated my professional profiles to remove any mention of him, and began the process of reclaiming my identity. The woman who'd turned down career opportunities to plan a wedding no longer existed. Sixth, the confrontation. David would try to salvage this, I knew. He'd have explanations, apologies, promises to change. He'd use every tool he'd perfected over the past 3 years to convince me that I was overreacting, that I'd misunderstood what I'd seen, that our love was worth fighting for. I needed to be prepared for that. More importantly, I needed to be immune to it. I spent Wednesday night writing out every lie he'd told, every boundary he'd crossed, every way he'd systematically diminished me over the course of our relationship. I wrote until my hand cramped, purging 3 years of suppressed doubts and ignored instincts onto paper. By Thursday morning, the beautiful apartment felt like a museum exhibit. How I used to live, a study in self-erasure. My phone rang as I was packing the last of my books. Dr. Krejci calling from Prague. Dr. Morrison. Her voice was warm with delight. I was so pleased to receive your email. Yes, the position is absolutely still available, and I can't think of anyone I'd rather have taken on. We talked for an hour about the exhibition, the city, the logistics of relocating. The job came with a furnished apartment for the first 3 months, assistance with visa paperwork, and a salary that was nearly double what I was making in New York. I have to ask, Dr. Krejci said toward the end of our conversation. What changed your mind? When we spoke before, you seemed quite settled in New York. I've realized that settling and thriving aren't the same thing, I said. I'm ready to prioritize the latter. Excellent. How soon can you start? How soon do you need me? Next week would be ideal, though I realize that's extremely short notice. Next week is perfect. I hung up the phone feeling lighter than I had in years. Thursday afternoon, I drove my car, which was titled In My Name Alone, thank God, to a storage facility and rented a unit. Everything I was keeping but couldn't take to Prague immediately went into storage. Everything else got donated to local charities. I kept my grandmother's jewelry box, even though the ring wasn't in it. David had made one crucial mistake in his deception. He'd forgotten that the ring wasn't the only thing my grandmother had left me. There were earrings, a necklace, a bracelet, all of them modest by David's standards, but priceless by mine because they represented the parts of my heritage he'd never been able to touch. Thursday night, I treated myself to dinner at my favorite restaurant, a tiny Italian place in the village that David had always dismissed as too noisy and not quite our style. I ordered wine, ate pasta without worrying about David's opinions on carbohydrates, and toasted silently to the woman I was about to become again. My flight to Prague was booked for Saturday morning. David would return Friday evening to find me gone. Friday morning, I did one final walkthrough of the apartment. It was pristine, exactly as David liked it, but now empty of any trace that I'd ever lived there. I'd left behind anything he'd given me, the clothes, the jewelry, the books he'd chosen for me to read. On the kitchen counter, I left my set of keys and a single sheet of paper with a typed message. David, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I know about Melissa, I know about the ring, I know about all of it. I've taken back exactly what was mine. Nothing more, nothing less. The money I transferred represents my half of shared expenses over the past 8 months, which I'd been covering entirely with my own salary while you've been funding your double life. I want my grandmother's ring back. You know why that ring is important to me, and you gave it away anyway. That tells me everything I need to know about who you really are. I've left a forwarded address with the building manager. Send the ring there. Don't contact me otherwise. Don't try to explain or apologize. Don't ask mutual acquaintances for information about where I've gone. I'm done with your version of love, and I'm done with the version of myself that accepted it. I hope Melissa makes you happy. More importantly, I hope she's stronger than I was. Sarah, P.S. The engagement is off. I've already canceled the venue, the caterer, and the flowers. You're welcome to keep the deposits. Consider it payment for 3 years of education in what I'll never accept again. I left the note weighted down by the engagement announcement we'd had printed but never sent, with David's face crossed out in red ink. Then I walked out of that apartment and never looked back. The plane lifted off from JFK at 8:47 a.m. on Saturday morning. As Manhattan fell away beneath me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, excitement about my future. Dr. Krejci met me at Václav Havel Airport with a bouquet of flowers and a smile that reached her eyes. Welcome to Prague, Dr. Morrison. Are you ready for an adventure? The apartment they'd arranged for me was small but bright, with tall windows that overlooked a cobblestone square in the old town. It was nothing like the sterile perfection of David's aesthetic. It was warm, lived in, full of character and history. It felt like home before I'd even unpacked my suitcase. I'd been in Prague for exactly 48 hours when my phone started ringing. David, calling from a number I didn't recognize since I'd blocked his primary line. I let it go to voicemail, then deleted the message without listening to it. He called 17 more times that day. I blocked each new number and deleted each message. The email started on Tuesday. Subject lines like, "Please let me explain. I made a mistake. We can work through this." All deleted without reading. On Wednesday, he somehow got my new work email address. The subject line read, "About your grandmother's ring." Against my better judgment, I opened it. "Sarah, I know you're angry and you have every right to be. What I did was unforgivable, and I understand why you felt you had to leave. But please, give me a chance to explain. Give us a chance to work through this. The situation with Melissa got complicated. She took the ring without permission, and when she posted that picture, I was as shocked as you were. I've gotten it back from her, and I want to return it to you. It belongs with you, and I know how much it means to your family. I've ended things with her completely. I told her about our engagement, about how much I love you, about how she was never anything more than a mistake I deeply regret. She was devastated, but she understood that what we had was meaningless compared to what you and I have built together. I've been thinking about what you said in your note, about the version of love you won't accept anymore. You're right. I haven't been the partner you deserve. I got comfortable, took you for granted, made decisions without considering how they would affect you. I see that now, and I want to change. I want to be the man you fell in love with again. Please come home, Sarah. Please let me show you that I can be better. We've invested 3 years in this relationship, planned a life together. Don't let one mistake destroy everything we've built. I love you more than I've ever loved anyone. You're the only woman I want to marry, the only person I want to build a future with. What happened with Melissa was an aberration, a moment of weakness that I'll regret for the rest of my life. Your grandmother's ring is waiting for you, along with the man who wants to spend the rest of his life proving he's worthy of wearing it. All my love, David. P.S. I've rescheduled the wedding for next spring. I know you'll want time to rebuild trust, and I'm willing to wait as long as it takes. I read the email twice, marveling at the masterclass in manipulation I was witnessing. Even now, even after being caught in the most devastating betrayal possible, David was trying to rewrite reality to minimize his actions and maximize my guilt. The ring had been taken without permission, as if Melissa had somehow stolen it, rather than received it as a symbol of their relationship. He'd been shocked by her Instagram post, as if he hadn't been the one to give her the ring in the first place. What they'd had was meaningless, except meaningful enough that he'd given her my family heirloom while planning to marry me. And of course, he'd already rescheduled our wedding, because clearly, the problem wasn't his betrayal, it was my overreaction to it. I closed the laptop and walked to my window, looking out at the medieval streets of Prague. In the distance, Prague Castle glowed in the afternoon sun, and I could hear the sound of church bells echoing across the red-tile rooftops. I was 4,500 miles away from David's version of reality, and it felt like I was breathing clean air for the first time in years. I deleted the email and blocked that address too. 3 weeks later, I received a package at my work address. Inside was my grandmother's ring, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, along with a handwritten letter from David. I didn't read the letter. I fed it directly into the shredder in our administrative office, but I held the ring up to the light and examined it carefully. It was clean, polished, apparently undamaged by its time with Melissa. But somehow, it looked different to me now. Smaller, maybe, or less significant than I'd remembered. I realized that the ring itself had never been the point. It was what it represented that mattered. The connection to my grandmother, the symbol of enduring love, the reminder of my own strength and heritage. David had corrupted that symbolism by giving it to another woman, but he couldn't erase what it had originally meant. I took the ring to a local jeweler and had it appraised, then researched my grandmother's family history more thoroughly than I ever had before. What I found was remarkable. My great-great-grandmother had been a prominent suffragette in Poland before the war, and my great-grandmother had been one of the first women to attend university in her adopted country of Canada. These were women who'd fought for their independence, who'd refused to be diminished by the men in their lives, who'd built legacies of strength and resilience. I'd dishonored that legacy by allowing David to make me smaller, but I wouldn't dishonor it further by letting his betrayal poison what the ring represented. I decided to keep it, but not to wear it. Instead, I placed it in a place of honor in my small Prague apartment, next to a photo of my grandmother and a growing collection of my own work. Exhibition catalogs, research papers, articles I was writing about the American art collection I was building for the museum. The ring would stay in my family, but it would represent the woman I was becoming, not the woman I'd been with David. Prague was a revelation. The city itself felt like a living museum, with Gothic cathedrals and Baroque palaces around every corner. But it was also vibrantly alive with contemporary art, world-class restaurants, and a thriving cultural scene. My work at the National Museum was challenging in the best possible way. The American art exhibition I was curating was unlike anything I'd done before, a comprehensive survey of how American artists had influenced and been influenced by European modernism. It required extensive research, travel to museums across the continent, and collaboration with scholars from a dozen different countries. For the first time in years, I was using my full intellectual capacity. I was making decisions independently, pursuing my own vision, building something that was entirely my own creation. The difference in my energy was remarkable. I woke up excited about my day, stayed late at the museum because I was genuinely engaged with my work, spent my evenings exploring the city or reading for pleasure, books I chose myself without checking whether they fit anyone else's aesthetic. I started taking photography seriously again, carrying my camera through Prague's winding streets and capturing images that spoke to me without worrying about whether they were sophisticated or meaningful by someone else's standards. I bought clothes that I loved, ate foods that appealed to me, made friends with colleagues and neighbors without filtering their personalities through David's preferences. Most surprisingly, I started dating. Not seriously, not with any intention of replacing what I'd lost, but simply because I was curious about what it felt like to interact with men who saw me as a complete person, rather than a project to be improved. The difference was startling. These men, colleagues, friends of friends, people I met at gallery openings or academic conferences, asked about my work with genuine interest. They respected my opinions, even when they disagreed with them. They seemed to genuinely enjoy my company without feeling the need to reshape me into their ideal woman. It was revolutionary. 2 months into my Prague adventure, I met Tomas. He was a visiting professor from Charles University, an art historian specializing in Czech surrealism, and we encountered each other in the museum's research library where we were both working late on a Thursday evening. He was younger than me by a few years, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an absent-minded way of running his hands through his dark hair when he was thinking. Our first conversation lasted 3 hours and covered everything from André Breton's manifestos to the best places in Prague to find authentic goulash. When the museum closed, we continued talking over dinner at a tiny restaurant near the river, then over wine at a bar in Wenceslas Square, then over coffee as the sun came up over the castle. "I should let you go," he said finally, glancing at his watch. "You must be exhausted." "I'm not," I said, surprised to realize it was true. "I feel more awake than I have in years." He smiled, and something warm unfurled in my chest, a feeling I'd almost forgotten existed. "Would you like to have dinner again tomorrow?" he asked. "I mean, tonight? Today?" He laughed, running his hand through his hair again. "I'm not sure what day it is anymore." "I'd love that," I said, and meant it completely. Our second date was dinner and a concert. Our third was a weekend trip to Český Krumlov, a medieval town that looked like it had been pulled from a fairy tale. Our fourth was cooking together in my apartment, where Tomas taught me how to make proper schnitzel, while I introduced him to my grandmother's recipe for challah. By our fifth date, I realized something profound. I'd completely forgotten to worry about what he thought of me. Not because I didn't care about him, I was already more than halfway to falling in love, but because it was clear that he liked me exactly as I was. He wasn't trying to improve me or guide me or reshape me into his vision of an ideal partner. He was simply enjoying getting to know the person I actually was. The revelation was intoxicating. "Can I ask you something personal?" Tomas said one evening as we walked along the Vltava River, the castle glowing golden in the distance. "Of course. You have this way of looking surprised when I ask for your opinion about things, as if you're not used to people caring what you think." I considered this. I was in a relationship for 3 years with someone who had very strong opinions about everything. I guess I got out of the habit of having my own preferences. "That sounds lonely." "It was," I said, surprised by the honesty in my own voice. "I just didn't realize it at the time." Tomas stopped walking and turned to face me. "Sarah, I hope you know that your opinions are one of the things I find most attractive about you. The way your whole face lights up when you talk about something you're passionate about. The way you see connections between things that other people miss. I could listen to you think out loud for hours." Something inside me that had been clenched tight for years finally began to relax. "Thank you," I said, and kissed him under the Charles Bridge while the lights of Prague reflected in the dark water below. 4 months into my new life, David found me on LinkedIn. I'd been careful about my social media presence, keeping my Instagram private and updating my professional profiles minimally, but apparently I hadn't been careful enough. The message was brief. "Sarah, I see you're doing well in Prague. I'm happy for you, though I have to admit I'm also heartbroken that it's happening without me. I hope someday you'll give us another chance. The life we plan together is still waiting for you if you want it. D." I stared at the message for a long time, trying to access the emotions I thought I should be feeling. Anger, maybe, or sadness, or some lingering flicker of the love I'd once felt for him. Instead, I felt nothing at all. David belonged to a version of myself that no longer existed. The woman who'd received that message was someone I remembered dimly, like a character in a book I'd read years ago and only half recalled. Her problems seemed distant, almost quaint in their smallness. I deleted the message and blocked his profile, then went back to preparing for my exhibition opening, which was scheduled for the following month. The opening was everything I dreamed it could be. The American art exhibition had grown into something magnificent under my curation, a thoughtful, nuanced exploration of cultural exchange that had already received attention from major art publications across Europe. The Prague Museum had never had an opening quite like it. The main gallery was packed with collectors, critics, academics, and art lovers from across the continent. Dr. Kredshi introduced me to the crowd with genuine warmth, praising my vision and expertise, and I felt a flush of pride that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. I had created something beautiful and meaningful, something that was entirely my own. Tomas was there, of course, beaming with pride from the back of the room. We'd been together for 2 months, and while it was still early, I could feel myself falling in love with him in a way that was completely different from anything I'd experienced with David. This love was expansive rather than contractive, energizing rather than diminishing. Tomas seemed to take genuine joy in my successes, and I found myself rooting for his achievements with equal enthusiasm. During my opening remarks to the assembled crowd, I spotted a familiar face in the audience. Chloe, my best friend from New York, the one David had convinced me was too dramatic. She'd flown to Prague to surprise me for the opening, and seeing her there, grinning and giving me an exaggerated thumbs up, almost made me cry with gratitude. After the formal presentation, she found me by the catering table. "Sarah fucking Morrison," she said, pulling me into a fierce hug. "Look at you, you brilliant badass." "I can't believe you're here," I said, laughing and crying at the same time. "How did you even—" "I followed the museum on Instagram. When I saw they were promoting this exhibition, I knew I had to come support you." She held me at arm's length, studying my face. "You look incredible. Different. Happy." "I am happy," I said, surprising myself with how easily the words came. "I'm really genuinely happy." "Good, you deserve it." Chloe glanced around the gallery, taking in the sophisticated crowd, the beautiful artwork, the obvious success of the event. "This is amazing, Sarah. I always knew you had this in you." We talked for hours that night, catching up on everything that had happened since we'd drifted apart during my relationship with David. Chloe had gotten married, bought a house, started her own consulting business, all milestones I'd missed because I'd been too absorbed in David's world to maintain our friendship. "I tried to reach out a few times," she admitted over late-night drinks in my apartment. "But you seemed so unreachable, like you were living behind glass or something." "I was," I said. "I just couldn't see it at the time." "What changed?" I thought about it, swirling the wine in my glass. "He gave my engagement ring to his mistress, and for the first time in 3 years, I got angry instead of sad." "Jesus, Sarah, I'm so sorry." "Don't be. Best thing that ever happened to me, honestly." Chloe raised her glass. "To the best thing that ever happened to you." "To remembering who I am," I corrected, and we drank to that. 6 months later, I received one final communication from David. It came in the form of a wedding announcement, forwarded by my sister Emma with a note. "Thought you should know. Got this in the mail today. Are you okay?" David and Melissa had gotten married in a small ceremony in the Hamptons. The photo on the announcement showed them embracing on a beach, both looking radiant and blissfully happy. Melissa was wearing a new ring, I noticed, something large and ostentatious that looked nothing like the modest heirloom David had given her originally. I studied the photo for a moment, trying to access some feeling about it. Jealousy, maybe, or vindication, or even relief that David had moved on and would stop trying to contact me. Instead, I found myself feeling something unexpected. Genuine happiness for them. Not because I thought David deserved happiness, though I suppose everyone does in some cosmic sense, but because their relationship finally made sense in a way that ours never had. Looking at that photo, I could see that they were perfectly suited for each other. Melissa clearly loved the version of love that David offered, possessive, controlling, aesthetically focused. And David had found a partner who wouldn't resist his attempts to reshape her into his ideal woman. They would probably be happy together in their way. And more importantly, they would leave me alone. I showed the announcement to Tomas that evening over dinner. "How do you feel about this?" he asked, studying the photo with academic interest. "Like I dodged a bullet," I said honestly, "and like I'm grateful to both of them for showing me what I didn't want." "And what do you want?" he asked, reaching across the table to take my hand. I looked around my Prague apartment, small but bright, filled with books I'd chosen and art I loved and photographs I'd taken. I looked at Tomas, whose face was open with genuine curiosity and affection, who asked questions because he wanted to know my answers, not because he was looking for opportunities to correct them. "This," I said simply. "I want exactly this." He smiled and brought my hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to my knuckles. "Good," he said, "because this is exactly what I want too." A year later, I was offered the permanent position of chief curator at the Prague National Museum, along with a significant salary increase and my own research budget. I accepted immediately and celebrated by buying my own apartment in the Vinohrady district, a bright, spacious place with tall windows and original hardwood floors that I furnished entirely according to my own taste. Tomas helped me move in, along with Chloe, who had started making regular trips to Prague to visit me. As we unpacked my belongings, books and artwork and photographs, plants and kitchen gadgets, and all the small personal things that make a space feel like home, I realized I was building the life I'd always wanted but had never believed I deserved. "Where should we put this?" Chloe asked, holding up my grandmother's ring in its place of honor beside the photo of my grandmother. "Right here," I said, indicating the mantel over the fireplace, "where I can see it every day and remember how strong the women in my family really are." That evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat in my new apartment with a glass of wine and reflected on the journey that had brought me here. 2 years ago, I'd been planning a wedding to a man who'd spent 3 years systematically erasing everything that made me who I was. I'd been living in an apartment that felt like a museum, working beneath my potential, isolated from friends and family, diminished in every way that mattered. Now, I was living in a city I loved, doing work that challenged and fulfilled me, surrounded by people who valued my opinions and celebrated my successes. I was in love with a man who enhanced rather than diminished me, who encouraged my ambitions rather than redirecting them to serve his own needs. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been lonely nights in the beginning, moments of doubt when I wondered if I'd given up too easily on the life David and I had planned together. There had been practical challenges, visa paperwork, language barriers, the simple logistics of building a life in a foreign country. But every challenge had been worth it for the gift of becoming myself again. My phone buzzed with a text from Tomas. "Thinking of you in your new home. Sleep well, beautiful dreamer." I smiled and typed back, "Thinking of you too. Thank you for helping me remember what love is supposed to feel like." "What does it feel like?" he responded. I looked around my apartment, my space filled with my things, arranged according to my preferences, and typed, "Like coming home to yourself." As I got ready for bed, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror and was struck by how different I looked. Not just older, though 2 years had certainly passed, but somehow more solid, more present in my own skin. My eyes were brighter, my posture straighter, my expression more confident. I looked like a woman who knew her own worth. I looked like my grandmother would have been proud to know me. Before turning off the lights, I glanced once more at the ring on my mantel, catching the light from the street lamps outside. Tomorrow, I would call my mother and tell her about my promotion, about Tomas, about the life I was building here in Prague. I would send photos of my apartment to Emma and schedule a visit home for the holidays. I would continue to build the life that honored the strong women who'd come before me and the strong woman I'd finally allowed myself to become. David had given my engagement ring to someone else, thinking he was taking something irreplaceable from me. Instead, he'd given me the gift of recognizing my own strength. I'd taken back everything that truly mattered and left the country not as an escape, but as a homecoming to myself.